We are back in the third hour on this October 19th, 2011 broadcast. Again, I'm Aaron Dyke sitting in until Alex is back tomorrow. But we are now joined by Alan Watt. He's a long-term researcher of really the true causes behind the various global changes going on and really has a sharp analysis of the unifying agenda behind it all. He's also a bit of a Renaissance man. He's done music, poetry, philosophy, written books, and many other items. Alan, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Yes, a pleasure to be back.
Now, Alan, we've seen so much happening with the Occupy Wall Street movement itself. In many ways, a diverse group. We've seen even many protesters targeting the Federal Reserve and other sort of heart of the beast systems, but at the same time, we've seen left-leaning Democratic factions trying to absorb that energy, trying to steer it back into the left-right paradigm of the main establishment, just as it happened with the Tea Party. So we wanted to today really have you break down how they trigger revolutions, how they steer them, how they see them coming, and how they help direct what the eventual outcome will be.
Well, it's all to do with geopolitics and a world agenda, a planned agenda, planned a long time ago, and many of the big leaders over the years have gone through this agenda. They've published books on it. The think tanks, they have openly declared their objectives. We find that they never sleep, by the way. They never sleep at 24 hours per day because they have shifts in the big think tanks. And they work full-time on bringing in a system of government for the world. And this is the age, actually. They call this the age of world managers. And we have been managed for quite some time as they privatize everything off in this kind of public-private partnership deal. And the system we're going into now is simply the transformation into the culmination of a worldwide system under really the United Nations. And that's what they're calling for now, you'll notice too. They're calling for world governance and to be under, and actually officially under the United Nations, which actually technically it is, because all laws have been coming through the United Nations for an awful lot of years across the whole world, right down to your building codes. So we're simply going through the transformation phases. Right now, too, it's like wars. These massive demonstrations have the same effect as a war. It changes society. You understand, most of the general public are passive viewers, that they're not participants in anything. And to change society and to get them to go along with it, you must convince everyone of the necessity of it, either through warfare or because of gross dissatisfaction amongst what appears to be on television massive factions of society, because it's them that you have to convince for the changes that are coming in. And believe you me, this is all part of the soft power technique that Brzezinski and Kissinger and the United Nations and many other think tanks have been using for years. They always start off with soft power. They've said that in the Middle East they would use soft power, sometimes increasing into hard military power when required, which we've watched over the last year or two. So it's our turn now to go through the same transformation into the planned society. The big bankers at the top, the ones who are international moneylenders, have always used geopolitics. They don't sit and wait for something to happen in the future. They plan the future. And they favor what's called socialism because it's big government. And big government always borrows from them. And big government also can keep tabs on the general public and keep them under control when necessary. The trick in big government is to bring in socialism and make the people think it's actually theirs for the first time. It's a fairer, juster, kinder, etc., etc. The stuff that Tony Blair used to spout out, as he was taught to do so well by his trainers as well. So you're seeing it happening in America too, because it's a global system.
Okay, Alan, hold that thought. We are just getting started on Alan's breakdown. We'll be back on the other side of the break. Infowars.com. Stay with us. Okay, we are back on the Alex Jones Show. Again, I'm Aaron Dyke sitting in until Alex is back tomorrow. I just want to remind you about the InfoWars Nightly News coming up at 7 p.m. tonight. We're going to break down some of the suppressed cancer cures and some of the hospitals that are carrying them out rather than chemotherapy. We're going to cover debate highlights and many other items from the breaking news. But right now we are joined by Alan Watt, really one of the most well-researched and deeply understood people who have analyzed what's going on in the global system behind what seems to be unrelated events going on in the world. Now, Alan, we have the planned economic crisis. They knew it was coming. They hedged their bets against it after abusing the system for decades. And now there's sort of this righteous anger that's brewed up, first in the Middle East, in various parts of Europe, and now it's hitting home in America. Help us understand what has been going on behind the scenes of all this.
Well, what you've had for years, actually, under the guise of, again, public-private partnerships, are really just a monopoly, a conglomerate of people into energy, taking the energy resources of the world. Now, remember, too, the Council on Foreign Relations, for an example, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs had their roots in the Milner Group, it was called at the time, International Financiers. These guys lent to nations, and they created this organization. And their plan was to take over all the resources of the world, all energy, all resources, food, water, and everything you need to live, basically, and bring in a planned world system, an economy which would be worldwide, using a socialist-type system to control the populace of the entire globe. These are the guys who designed the free trade deals. They wanted all the barriers brought down. Of course, they wouldn't lose money for the nations in the meantime because they would replace it with a value-added tax, or in the case of Canada, a general sales tax. And then at the same time, they would do away with borders gradually, split the world into regions, and have the free flow of goods and labor. And therefore, multiculturalism was a big, big part of their agenda too. And so the guy who was the Tony Blair's right-hand man and the vice prime minister, basically, admitted that in the British newspapers, that Blair had told him that the agenda was to completely open the floodgates to Britain, to the most diverse cultures, in order to destroy the culture of Britain forever. That was to go by the wayside. That ties in with the educational system, the Frankfurt School, John Dewey. John Dewey said eventually we'll eradicate all conflicting history where people had old grievances with neighbours, etc. That's already been done, actually, under the European Union. They're eliminating history prior to World War I, basically. And it's taught in schools now. Nothing happened before it. It's like in Cambodia, when they started off with year one for when it took over. It's very, very similar. So we're seeing a new world order, and this is what it's all about. It's a world order where only a few big international corporations own supplies of the world. They're still going after the last parts of the resources, the gas. Uganda, for instance, is one of the world's largest untapped oil fields underneath there, plus cobalt and gas, natural gas as well, which they want for this East African Federation, and that's why that's so strategically important to get in there and get them conquered as well. So it's all about resources, because these boys at the top plan this world, planned economy, planned society, right down to how many people will be allowed to have children, etc. And they use China as the model state to copy one child per parent, or parents, depending on how you look at it today, etc. And also they want to plan you from birth to death, what you will do, what you'll work at. You'll be tested scientifically for your abilities, and it'll be schooled to work only more perfected. It's a more perfected version of the laboratory that was the Soviet Union, which they also funded, the same big international organizations. So we're going through the same thing here. And they must convince the Americans at home that it's necessary that we have this particular change. And that's what the hype was about in the last century in academia, because academia was brought on board very early on. The Council on Foreign Relations, Lord Bertrand Russell, all the big boys who helped plan this present time we're living in right now, and the cultures that we're going through, the changes. These guys said we bring academia on board because they will train the future world managers. So forget the ones beneath them, the working class, go for the managerial classes, and they'll be on board with us. Well, they've done that, and academia, in cahoots with this new expert-driven world governance, will run your life in a scientific fashion, a scientific dictatorship, actually. It was called by the first United Nations UNESCO CEO, and that was Huxley's brother, Julian Huxley. So this is what we're going through now, the big changes towards their goal into a planned economy. And they're even using energy, which was planned back in the 1920s, 1930s under Technocracy, Inc. It was a new theory put out by the same boys, by the way, Council on Foreign Relations and Royal Institute of International Affairs, to take over the world's energy supplies. And really all money was a unit that they would use against the value of energy units. And eventually they'd be replaced by energy units. Well, we have carbon taxes, carbon units coming in right now. And eventually it will be how much it costs in energy units to keep you as an individual alive. So this is the actual whole conglomerate of the Fabian Society, which was just a left-wing part of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, backed by multi-billionaires. I mean, the Astor family helped to kick it off and fund it. And the big bankers, of course, creating the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations. And they have branches across the entire planet. And George Soros, in fact, is the CEO of the whole of the European Parliament group. He's the head of that. So it's the same organization across the world. You go in India, in Africa, all of Australia, all the British Commonwealth countries have their memberships. And this is the planned system that's taken them over 100 years to achieve. We're going through parts of the stages right now.
Yeah, I really had to back you up when you trace the history of anyone. For example, the Rockefeller Foundation, it's hard to find where they deviate from that Cecil Rhodes Roundtable group that have steered off into so many of the entities you mentioned. But help bring us up to speed of how they saw the current revolutions coming and how they've prepared for it and where they plan to take it as part of their larger world government takeover.
Mm-hmm. Well, number one, they always know there's going to be a backlash whenever they do something. But it's a plan. It's a cooperated, I call it cooperation and backlash, because they remember these guys run the big far-left groups. They run and finance them. In fact, your own governments have been financing them for the last 50 years, the same organizations. They all get tax-funded and foundation-funded. So this is the ones that they simply trot out on cue to bring in a juster, fairer globalism, actually. If you look at most of these protesters, it isn't just about America. In fact, America's at the bottom of the list. It's about a fairer globalism and a world governance under the United Nations for all workers of the world, etc., etc. I understand, too, the strategy of their owners, because those who own the world, basically, must keep the working classes under control and make them think they're going to get something out of this. But just like the Soviet system, they always make sure that you think you're going to get something out of it for yourselves, a juster, fairer, kinder society. But in reality, the world is planned to go under communitarianism. Britain is the flagship, as you know. You have these NGOs already created that are coming in and just appointing themselves as leaders of your communities. One's for energy consumption, one's for wastage disposal. You've got NGO leaders for environmental, for your area. They just happen to be there. They're already trained. And this is the perfect Soviet. Soviet meant rule by councils. And councils in the Soviet Union were non-governmental organizations. And, of course, their leaders were appointed by the KGB and the Politburo. And in the West, they're appointed again by the shadow government, if you might call it that. So it's the same system, only more perfected, and that's what they're actually calling it in some quarters.
Yeah, and it's amazing. And the same group that creates the crisis, of course, typically brings the solution. That's the whole formula at hand. So how do they predict the timing of these they see these revolutions coming? It happened with the Arab Spring, but we know it's something they were developing for years, Alan.
Yes. Well, absolutely. They've been working on Africa for an awful long time. And Mandela's in it too. He wants an African Union. And of course, what they've really decided to do is initially started off with regional parts of Africa, unions for each one of them. The United Nations is heavily involved. In fact, all of the Western councillors and bureaucracies are heavily involved too, setting up the State Department's heavily involved too. So they want these regions, and it's all, again, to do with free trade, allowing the big mega corporations in to take control of all energy and mineral resources, everything they can get out of those countries, under the guise of sharing it to the world, the wealth of the world, etc. Then released it's all to pass through the masters of the world who already own the wealth of the world and really consolidate their power over all goods, etc., all necessities of life. And all they have to do in the meantime is knock down the petty dictators they've already put in for a certain phase who've now served their purpose and are getting too comfortable in their seats. They don't really want to part and leave the throne.